Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of True Crime with Caitlyn. Today we're going to be talking about a case which took 41 years to solve due to a major miscarriage of justice. This is the case of Janet Commins. Janet Commins was born on the 9th of June 1960. She was the only child to super hard-working and caring parents Edward and Eileen. Her dad, who went by Ted, worked in the army before leaving so that he could be closer to home, getting into the steelwork industry, and her mum had been a qualified nurse for most of her working life. The family lived in a bungalow on King Edward's Drive in Flint, northeast Wales, Janet often going out and playing in the street with her cousins who lived close by. Janet was described as a shy, timid girl. She was a homebody who still enjoyed playing with her dolls even at 15 years old. Very much like myself, I am 100% a homebody and I played with my Barbies till I was in like year 10, I think. Eileen would say that despite Janet being a teenager, she was still very much a child. She wasn't one of these 15 going on 20 type of girls. She attended nearby Flint High School where she was a liked student and mostly kept herself to herself within her small friendship group. In 1975, Flint would open up their first leisure centre, which is now the Jade Jones Pavilion. I couldn't find if that's what it was called back in 1975, but that's what it is now. It had a swimming pool which attracted a lot of the youngsters in Flint, and Janet was no exception. She and her friends enjoyed going to the pool together and having lots of fun. On the 7th of January 1968, 15-year-old Janet asked her mum Eileen if she could go with her friends to the leisure centre to go swimming. Eileen looked at Janet, who appeared to have lost her colour a bit. She thought that her daughter was a little bit under the weather and not wanting to bring on a full-on cold. Eileen said no. It was freezing, it was bang in the middle of winter, and Eileen was probably thinking that she didn't want Janet going swimming, getting her hair soaking wet and then walking back home like that, as that would for sure make her poorly. Janet tried to convince Eileen to please let her go, and when Eileen wasn't budging, Janet stormed into her room in a sulk. Sometime later, at around about 7:30 p.m, Eileen went to check in on Janet, who she knew was very upset. She opened the bedroom door, finding the room empty. Lay on Janet's bed was a note that she had written. She was not going to be missing out on the fun, so she had snuck out and assured her parents that she would be back home by 8:30 p.m. And so Ted and Eileen waited. 8:30 p.m. rolled around and Janet still wasn't home. Because her curfew wasn't actually until 9 p.m, her parents didn't worry too much at this point. Maybe she had just lost track of time. They also knew that the pool closed at 9, so she shouldn't be out for much longer. However, as the hours began to tick by, 9 p.m, then 10 p.m, then 11 p.m, Ted and Eileen were frantic and could wait no longer for their daughter to come home. One of the parents would leave the bungalow, walking down to the police station to report Janet missing. In many cases, we hear that someone cannot be reported missing until they've been missing for 24 hours at least. However, because of the cold, bitter night and because this was completely out of character for Janet, she'd never ran away before, never even threatened to, police sprung into action to try and find her. A team of officers were dispatched to search all around the proximity of the leisure centre, and as the days of the search went on, the officers would extend their search further. The search for Janet was huge, consisting of officers, ununiformed officers, friends, family, volunteers, all searching in desperation. However, Janet was nowhere to be found. On the 11th of January, three children who were playing hide and seek on a field nearby Gwynedd Primary School would discover the body of 15-year-old Janet Commins. She had been hid under a dense group of thick bushes and was covered in twigs and sticks to further conceal her. Heartbreakingly, this area where she was found was only a 10-minute walk away from her home. When her body was discovered by the children, Janet was lay on her back but sort of leaning on her side. She was fully clothed minus her shoes, which had likely slipped off as her body was dragged to the bushes. During her autopsy, it was found that Janet had been savagely sexually assaulted both vaginally and anally. She had bruises and abrasions on her neck and her chin, along with a wound on her scalp. She also had internal pinpoint hemorrhages, which is tiny spots of blood consistent with a blood vessel bursting in her eye. Pathologist Dr. Reuben Woodcock determined that Janet's cause of death was from asphyxia, that she likely either had her face covered by her killer's hand or her face pushed into the ground as he raped her, and that she had suffocated to death. Sperm samples were extracted from Janet and carefully stored, but remember, DNA testing was nowhere near as advanced as it is now in 2025. From this sample, all that they were able to really determine was the blood type of the killer, which was a type O, so at least they had something to compare and aid in eliminating suspects. Mud that was extracted from Janet's clothes was analysed, and I always find this really fascinating when I come across this investigative technique in my research. So, using this mud sample, the investigators were able to determine that the attack, rape and killing likely took place within Flint's Gorset Circle. When I looked into Gorset Circle, I could only find a bus stop which is situated 2 streets away from Janet's home, so she was almost there before her killer pounced on her. Over the road from the bus stop there is a large field which leads directly into the foresty area where Janet's body was found by the children. It's heartbreaking that Janet was so close to home when she was killed, that her body was laid not even 400 yards away for over 3 days before she was discovered. To say that the news of Janet's horrific death rocked the small community of Flint would be an absolute understatement. It was nationwide news. The then small community was in complete and utter shock at how such a young, innocent girl could be brutalized and killed on their doorstep. The councillor of Flint would say that the crime had, quote, a profound and devastating effect on Flint. An immense manhunt ensued to find the man responsible for killing 15-year-old Janet. Over 120 officers conducted fingertip searches around the crime scene, meaning that they were literally on their hands and knees scouring for evidence. Janet's missing shoes would be recovered around about 100 meters from where her body was found, but I don't know how much evidentiary value they had. Door-to-door inquiries were conducted, meaning police had spoke to approximately 10,000 people. They spoke to over 1,000 students at Flint High School, but neither really provided any solid leads. Speaking of the school, some of Janet's friends had begun receiving threatening and frankly terrifying letters saying that they were next and that they had to look out. This terrified the poor young girls and they feared even walking to school in the broad daylight. When the writer of these disgusting letters was finally tracked down, it was found that they actually had nothing to do with the killing. They were just from a sick individual who enjoyed knocking fear into young girls as some sort of sick, cruel joke. All local men between the ages of 17 and 22 were interviewed and were asked to provide police with their whereabouts on the evening of Janet's killing, and they had to corroborate that too, which I can imagine took a lot of time and a lot of work. Despite all of their investigative efforts, the officers came no closer to discovering who had killed Janet, and the community were in uproar. They were scared and their fear soon turned to anger. Police would finally catch a break in the case when they were approached by 17-year-old Linda Eibal. Linda told the police about a concerning interaction that she had had with her fiance/boyfriend Noel Jones. Noel was an 18-year-old traveller originally from Wrexham. He was almost illiterate, not being able to read or to write, and he had learning difficulties. Noel was working as a scrap man, so he spent a lot of time going all around the streets, which he had become familiar with, sometimes late at night, taking scrap metal to go and sell or do whatever they do after collecting all the scrap. During initial inquiries, the police did actually talk to Noel, who said that he had no knowledge about the crime whatsoever, so I guess he didn't stand out to them up until Linda approached the police. She told them that Noel had admitted to her that he killed Janet, and he was trying to say it in almost like a jokey way so he could kind of grasp how she was going to react to it. After this, she began piecing together Noel's strange behaviour after Janet's death, and suddenly the pieces began to create a picture. She remembered Noel to be what she believed pressuring her into providing him with an alibi for the night of January 7th, the night that Janet disappeared. Linda would do all of her own beauty stuff at home, which included bleaching her own hair, and she remembered one day having some bleach left over and Noel allowed her to dye his hair, lightening it, changing his appearance. So with all this, the alleged force to provide an alibi, the jokey confession, and Noel willing, allowing his appearance to change, Linda began to think, could her partner, the man that she was set to marry once she turned 18, be Janet Commins's vicious killer? With no other leads to follow and desperate to get the case solved, police would arrest Noel Jones and his friend Michael Orford on suspicion of murder. Quite quickly, Michael would be bailed and nothing was ever pursued against him because of the sheer lack of evidence, despite police believing that there was more than one perpetrator involved in the crime. The same wouldn't apply to Noel though. He would be intensely grilled by interrogators for 2 days straight. He had begun his interviews completely denying participating or even having any knowledge about the killing, and he explained his jokey confession to Linda, saying that it was no more than that, it was a joke. But police didn't buy his story, not even for a split second. They were convinced that Noel was their man, they just had that gut feeling, so they continued to press and press and press him up until he cracked, finally confessing. As per protocol, Noel was asked to provide a written and signed statement, but because he was illiterate, he had to get the assistance of an officer. Together, they wrote 2 detailed confessions about the night Janet disappeared and about the killing. This officer, by the way, is one of the officers that arrested him. He is not on Noel's side. Because Noel couldn't read, he again had to rely on an officer accurately reading the written statements back to him before he signed them. Police would also take a blood sample from Noel, which proved that his blood type was type O, the same blood type as the person who left the semen sample on Janet's body. Flint police were happy. They had their man. At some point, I guess Noel had retracted his confession and his written statements, and so when his trial began in June 1976, he went in pleading not guilty to murder. This plea had no effect on the detectives or the prosecution, as they were confident that they had the right man. Noel was essentially handed in by his partner, someone that he loved and someone that he trusted. The blood groups matched and he confessed, sharing details that only the killer would know. He's only pleading not guilty now to try and save his own skin and try and worm his way out of it. That is what the mentality of the detectives were. During a recess on the second day of his trial, Noel's solicitor weighed out his options to him. The prosecution had damning evidence, and if he was found guilty of murder, he may never be released from prison. However, if they put forward a plea of manslaughter, there is a possibility that he might be released from prison one day. Fearing that his freedom may be stripped away from him for the rest of his life, Noel went with the latter. The judge accepted a plea of guilty of the manslaughter, rape and buggery of Janet Commins. I hadn't heard of buggery before, and the definition of it is, quote, anal sexual intercourse. Pleading guilty to all three of these charges, Noel Jones would be handed a sentence of 12 years to serve. Noel's time in prison would be nothing short of absolute hell. He was surrounded by other men who were fathers, grandfathers, brothers, uncles and boyfriends, and after they learned that he had admitted to raping and killing an innocent 15-year-old girl, it put him on the top of their hit list. When he wasn't on suicide watch or in solitary confinement, he would be subjected to multiple beatings. He would be spat on, other inmates made threats to kill him, along with much more verbal abuse. He was once in solitary confinement for 18 months, but not as a punishment for acting up or anything like that, but for his own safety. That is how much danger Noel was in. Throughout his time in prison, he made no appeals, and after serving half of his 12-year sentence, Noel Jones would be released from prison in 1984 at 24 years old. Now, I have a question for you. What would infuriate you more? A child killer and a rapist getting a manslaughter plea and being released from prison after only serving 6 years with a full life ahead of him, or learning that the wrong man had gone through hell for 6 years for a crime that he didn't even commit, and that the real killer was still out there and wouldn't be caught for another 32 years? In 2006, Janet Commins' case, which was closed as the person that they believed killed her, Noel Jones, had served his time, was getting looked into again. As I mentioned earlier, when police arrested Noel, they also arrested another man named Michael Orford, but he was let off because there was a lack of evidence. Also back then, the police believed that there was more than one perpetrator involved in Janet's killing. Because it's now 2006, DNA testing had came on leaps and bounds. So a cold case review team decided to have a look into Janet's case, more specifically that sperm sample, to see if they could link that to Michael. Using the carefully stored sample, a DNA profile was extracted and input into the national database. However, there were no matches. Noel hadn't reoffended after being released, or at least not after 1994, and when he was imprisoned in 1976, it wasn't mandatory to provide a DNA sample. According to the National Institutes of Health, it didn't become mandatory until 1994, so because he hadn't reoffended since then, that's why Noel's DNA also wasn't on the database. This was a disappointment to the cold case detective, as they truly believed that Michael was involved, and it would be another 10 years before there was any sort of movement on the case. In 2016, a 15-year-old girl reported being sexually assaulted by a much older man. This man had groomed the young girl and offered her to throw a house party at his home where he would provide her and her friends with alcohol. During this party, she would end up being sexually assaulted by this man and bravely went on to tell police. This man was 58-year-old Stephen Hoff. When he was arrested, his DNA was taken and uploaded to the national database, where it pinged as being a match to the semen sample found on Janet Commins. Stephen Anthony Hoff was born in 1958 and lived in Flint most of his life. In fact, his house overlooked the back of Gwinnett Primary School where Janet's body was discovered. He was only 16 years old when he attacked, viciously raped and murdered Janet Commins. He actually turned 17 the day after her body was discovered. Stephen was big for his age and really strong and powerful. He played a lot of rough contact sport, including ice hockey and rugby, which he excelled in both. He was on the senior rugby team too, not like an under-18s group. He was participating in this very rough sport with fully grown men, and he was only 16. You can imagine that given his strength and stature, he was very intimidating. And Stephen liked that. He was a bully who would look down to others and pick on other kids for no reason. He attended Flint High School and was in the year above Janet, although I don't know if they had any sort of interaction or even really knew each other in school. During the investigation into Janet's death, Stephen was questioned by police. He fell within that age bracket where police were questioning all of the young men, and they recalled that he was jittery, nervous, and was evasive with his answers to the questions. When the officers pressed him a little bit more, his behaviour being suspicious, he provided them with an odd alibi. He said that he didn't know anything about Janet, but he was acting the way that he was because he was out committing petty crime. He admitted that he had been breaking into cars, stealing petrol, and masturbating in public. So no, he didn't know anything about Janet, but he did about these. This seemed enough for the officers who arrested, prosecuted, and eventually fined Stephen for this. As innocent Noel Jones is sat in prison serving time for a horrific crime that he had no part in, Stephen continued on with his life, believing that he had got away with it. However, this didn't mean that his violent tendencies had gone. In 1980, Stephen joined the British Army and was stationed in Germany. While here, he got married. This woman, who I couldn't find the name of, was actually local to Flint, so I don't know if they'd been dating for a while and she took the plunge and followed him over to Germany, or if they coincidentally met, or what happened there. The details of his time stationed overseas are quite vague, so what I'm about to tell you is all of the information that I could find. In 1998, while still in Germany, Stephen had spent the whole day drinking. He was in a hotel where he lunged at a female receptionist, dragging her into the toilet and attempted to assault her. Stephen pressed his hands around the woman's neck, strangling her until she almost passed out. He would be interrupted by another man coming into the toilet, so he didn't have the chance to do whatever it is that he was planning. For this, the court-martial, which is the Army's own court, convicted Stephen of grievous bodily harm and sentenced him to 5 years inside of military prison. Upon his release, he would be discharged and made his way back to Flint. For the next few years, Stephen Hoff seemingly lived a normal life. He settled down with his wife only a few doors down from his childhood home, and together they had 2 children. There was nothing else noted about Stephen up until that 15-year-old girl reported being sexually assaulted. The DNA taken from the 15-year-old girl's sexual assault and the semen samples DNA that were extracted from Janet's body were a perfect match. There was a 1 in billion chance that this DNA belonged to anyone else. In 2016, 41 years after the death of Janet Commins, Stephen Hoff was finally arrested. During his questioning, he denied any involvement with Janet's death and mostly answered no comment to the interrogator's questions. He offered up no explanation as to how or why his DNA ended up on Janet's body if he wasn't the killer. When the officers made the family aware that they had arrested someone who wasn't Noel, they were in complete shock. Sadly, by now, Janet's father, Ted, had passed away. The family would say that he never got over Janet's death and that, quote, after Janet's death, he lost interest in life. He couldn't talk about his daughter or even look at pictures of her. It simply hurt him too much. 58-year-old Stephen Hoff's trial began at Mold Crown Court. During the 13-day trial, Noel Jones bravely testified, telling his story, how he'd known the whole time that he was innocent, that being sent to prison absolutely destroyed and shattered his life, and that the 6 years that he was in there was like a living hell. He went into detail about the pressure that he was put under by police to give over false confessions, how he didn't even have a lawyer with him during any of his questioning, he didn't know that he could have one to aid him, and how he was coerced and scared into appealing his conviction. The police and prosecutors had knocked the fear into him, telling him that if he appealed, he could go down for murder and he would never see the light of day again. After hearing all of the evidence, the jury deliberated for 5.5 hours, finding Stephen Hoff guilty of the manslaughter, rape and buggery of 15-year-old Janet Commins. He would be handed a sentence of 12 years to serve. Thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. Don't forget to follow the podcast wherever you're listening so that you'll never miss an episode. Make sure to head over to my Instagram at TrueCrimeCaitlyn, where you'll be able to see pictures relating to this case and for any and all updates. Drop a comment on my latest post and let me know what you think about this case, and I will see you all in 2 weeks' time with a brand new episode.